35.3 The central nervous system. By the end of this section, you will be able to do the following. Identify the spinal cord, cerebral lobes, and other brain areas on a diagram of the brain. Describe the basic functions of the spinal cord, cerebral lobes, and other brain areas. The central nervous system, CNS, is made up of the brain, a part of which is shown in figure 35.19, and spinal cord, and is covered with 3 layers of protective coverings called meninges, from the Greek word for membrane. The outermost layer is the dura. 35.3. The central nervous system 995 Mater, Latin for hard mother. As the Latin suggests, the primary function for this thick layer is to protect the brain and spinal cord. The dura mater also contains vein-like structures that carry blood from the brain back to the heart. The middle layer is the web-like arachnoid mater. The last layer is the pia mater, Latin for soft mother, which directly contacts and covers the brain and spinal cord like plastic wrap. The space between the arachnoid and pia maters is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. CSF is produced by a tissue called choroid plexus in fluid-filled compartments in the CNS called ventricles. The brain floats in CSF, which acts as a cushion and shock absorber and makes the brain neutrally buoyant. CSF also functions to circulate chemical substances throughout the brain and into the spinal cord. The entire brain contains only about 8.5 tablespoons of CSF, but CSF is constantly produced in the ventricles. This creates a problem. When a ventricle is blocked, the CSF builds up and creates swelling and the brain is pushed against the skull. This swelling condition is called hydrocephalus, waterhead, and can cause seizures, cognitive problems, and even death if a shunt is not inserted to remove the fluid and pressure. Figure 35.19 The cerebral cortex is covered by 3 layers of meninges, the dura, arachnoid, and pia maters. Credit. Modification of work by Gray's Anatomy, Brain. The brain is the part of the central nervous system that is contained in the cranial cavity of the skull. It includes the cerebral cortex, limbic system, basal ganglia, thalamus, hypothalamus, and cerebellum. There are 3 different ways that a brain can be sectioned in order to view internal structures. A sagittal section cuts the brain left to right, as shown in figure 35.21b. A coronal section cuts the brain front to back, as shown in figure 35.20a, and a horizontal section cuts the brain top to bottom. Cerebral cortex. The outermost part of the brain is a thick piece of nervous system tissue called the cerebral cortex, which is folded into hills called gyri, singular, gyrus, and valleys called sulci, singular, sulcus. The cortex is made up of 2 hemispheres, right and left, which are separated by a large sulcus. A thick fiber bundle called the corpus callosum, Latin, tough body, connects the 2 hemispheres and allows information to be passed from one side to the other. Although there are some brain functions that are localized more to one hemisphere than the other, the functions of the 2 hemispheres are largely redundant. In fact, sometimes, very rarely, an entire hemisphere is removed to treat severe epilepsy. While patients do suffer some deficits following the surgery, they can have surprisingly few problems, especially when the surgery is performed on children who have very immature nervous systems. 996 Chapter 35. The Nervous System. Access for free at OpenStax.org. Figure 35.20 These illustrations show the A. coronal and B. sagittal sections of the human brain. In other surgeries to treat severe epilepsy, the corpus callosum is cut instead of removing an entire hemisphere. This causes a condition called split brain, which gives insights into unique functions of the 2 hemispheres. For example, when an object is presented to patients' left visual field, they may be unable to verbally name the object, and may claim to not have seen an object at all. This is because the visual input from the left visual field crosses and enters the right hemisphere and cannot then signal to the speech center, which generally is found in the left side of the brain. Remarkably, if a split brain patient is asked to pick up a specific object out of a group of objects with the left hand, the patient will be able to do so but will still be unable to vocally identify it. Link to learning. See this website, http://openstax.org/l/split-brain to learn more about split brain patients and to play a game where you can model the split brain experiments yourself. Each cortical hemisphere contains regions called lobes that are involved in different functions. Scientists use various techniques to determine what brain areas are involved in different functions. They examine patients who have had injuries or diseases that affect specific areas and see how those areas are related to functional deficits. They also conduct animal studies where they stimulate brain areas and see if there are any behavioral changes. They use a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, to temporarily deactivate specific parts of the cortex using strong magnets placed outside the head. And they use functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to look at changes in oxygenated blood flow in particular brain regions that correlate with specific behavioral tasks. These techniques, and others, have given great insight into the functions of different brain regions but have also showed that any given brain area can be involved in more than one behavior or process, and any given behavior or process generally involves neurons in multiple brain areas. That being said, each hemisphere of the mammalian cerebral cortex can be broken down into 4 functionally and spatially defined lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Figure 35.21 illustrates these 4 lobes of the human cerebral cortex. Figure 35.21 The human cerebral cortex includes the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. 35.3 The central nervous system 997 The frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain, over the eyes. This lobe contains the olfactory bulb, which processes smells. The frontal lobe also contains the motor cortex, which is important for planning and implementing movement. Areas within the motor cortex map to different muscle groups, and there is some organization to this map, as shown in Figure 35.22. For example, the neurons that control movement of the fingers are next to the neurons that control movement of the hand. Neurons in the frontal lobe also control cognitive functions like maintaining attention, speech, and decision-making. Studies of humans who have damaged their frontal lobe show that parts of this area are involved in personality, socialization, and assessing risk. Figure 35.22 Different parts of the motor cortex control different muscle groups. Muscle groups that are neighbors in the body are generally controlled by neighboring regions of the motor cortex as well. For example, the neurons that control finger movement are near the neurons that control hand movement. The parietal lobe is located at the top of the brain. Neurons in the parietal lobe are involved in speech and also reading. 2 of the parietal lobe's main functions are processing somatosensation, touch sensations like pressure, pain, heat, cold, and processing proprioception, the sense of how parts of the body are oriented in space. The parietal lobe contains a somatosensory map of the body similar to the motor cortex. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the brain. It is primarily involved in vision, seeing, recognizing, and identifying the visual world. The temporal lobe is located at the base of the brain by your ears and is primarily involved in processing and interpreting sounds. It also contains the hippocampus, Greek for seahorse, a structure that processes memory formation. The hippocampus is illustrated in Figure 35.24. The role of the hippocampus in memory was partially determined by studying one famous epileptic patient, who had both sides of his hippocampus removed in an attempt to cure his epilepsy. His seizures went away, but he could no longer form new memories, although he could remember some facts from before his surgery and could learn new motor tasks. Evolution connection cerebral cortex compared to other vertebrates. Mammals have exceptionally large brains for their body size. An entire alligator's brain, for example, would fill about 1.5 teaspoons. This increase in brain-to-body size ratio is especially pronounced in apes, whales, and dolphins. While this increase in overall brain size doubtlessly played a role in the evolution of complex behaviors unique to mammals, it does not tell the whole story. Scientists have found a relationship between the relatively high surface area of the cortex and the intelligence and complex social behaviors exhibited by some mammals. This increased surface area is due, in part, to increased folding of the cortical sheet, more sulci and gyri. For example, a rat cortex is very smooth with very few sulci and gyri. Cat and sheep cortices have more sulci and gyri. Chimps, humans, and dolphins have even more. 998 Chapter 35. The Nervous System Access for free at OpenStax.org. Figure 35.23 Mammals have larger brain-to-body ratios than other vertebrates. Within mammals, increased cortical folding and surface area is correlated with complex behavior. Basal ganglia interconnected brain areas called the basal ganglia, or basal nuclei, shown in Figure 35.20b, play important roles in movement control and posture. Damage to the basal ganglia, as in Parkinson's disease, leads to motor impairments like a shuffling gait when walking. The basal ganglia also regulate motivation. For example, when a wasp sting led to bilateral basal ganglia damage in a 25-year-old businessman, he began to spend all his days in bed and showed no interest in anything or anybody. But when he was externally stimulated, as when someone asked to play a card game with him, he was able to function normally. Interestingly, he and other similar patients do not report feeling bored or frustrated by their state. Thalamus. The thalamus, Greek for inner chamber, illustrated in Figure 35.24, acts as a gateway to and from the cortex. It receives sensory and motor inputs from the body and also receives feedback from the cortex. This feedback mechanism can modulate conscious awareness of sensory and motor inputs depending on the attention and arousal state of the animal. The thalamus helps regulate consciousness, arousal, and sleep states. A rare genetic disorder called fatal familial insomnia causes the degeneration of thalamic neurons and glia. This disorder prevents affected patients from being able to sleep, among other symptoms, and is eventually fatal. 35.3. The central nervous system. 999 Figure 35.24. The limbic system regulates emotion and other behaviors. It includes parts of the cerebral cortex located near the center of the brain, including the cingulate gyrus and the hippocampus, as well as the thalamus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. Hypothalamus. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, shown in Figure 35.24. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine system by sending signals to the pituitary gland, a pea-sized endocrine gland that releases several different hormones that affect other glands as well as other cells. This relationship means that the hypothalamus regulates important behaviors that are controlled by these hormones. The hypothalamus is the body's thermostat. It makes sure key functions like food and water intake, energy expenditure, and body temperature are kept at appropriate levels. Neurons within the hypothalamus also regulate circadian rhythms, sometimes called sleep cycles. Limbic system. The limbic system is a connected set of structures that regulates emotion, as well as behaviors related to fear and motivation. It plays a role in memory formation and includes parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus as well as the hippocampus. One important structure within the limbic system is a temporal lobe structure called the amygdala, Greek for almond, illustrated in Figure 35.24. The two amygdala are important both for the sensation of fear and for recognizing fearful faces. The cingulate gyrus helps regulate emotions and pain. Cerebellum. The cerebellum, Latin for little brain, shown in Figure 35.21, sits at the base of the brain on top of the brainstem. The cerebellum controls balance and aids in coordinating movement and learning new motor tasks. Brainstem. The brainstem, illustrated in Figure 35.21, connects the rest of the brain with the spinal cord. It consists of the midbrain, medulla oblongata, and the pons. Motor and sensory neurons extend through the brainstem, allowing for the relay of signals between the brain and spinal cord. Ascending neural pathways cross in this section of the brain, allowing the left hemisphere of the cerebrum to control the right side of the body and vice versa. The brainstem coordinates motor control signals sent from the brain to the body. The brainstem controls several important functions of the body, including alertness, arousal, breathing, blood pressure, digestion, heart rate, swallowing, walking, and sensory and motor information integration. Spinal cord. Connecting to the brainstem and extending down the body through the spinal column is the spinal cord, shown in Figure 35.21. The spinal cord is a thick bundle of nerve tissue that carries information about the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. The spinal cord is contained within the bones of the vertebrate column but is able to communicate signals to and from the 1000. Chapter 35. The nervous system. Access for free at OpenStax.org. Body. Through its connections with spinal nerves, part of the peripheral nervous system. A cross-section of the spinal cord looks like a white oval containing a gray butterfly shape, as illustrated in Figure 35.25. Myelinated axons make up the white matter, and neuron and glial cell bodies make up the gray matter. Gray matter is also composed of interneurons, which connect two neurons each located in different parts of the body. Axons and cell bodies in the dorsal, facing the back of the animal, spinal cord convey mostly sensory information from the body to the brain. Axons and cell bodies in the ventral, facing the front of the animal, spinal cord primarily transmit signals controlling movement from the brain to the body. The spinal cord also controls motor reflexes. These reflexes are quick, unconscious movements, like automatically removing a hand from a hot object. Reflexes are so fast because they involve local synaptic connections. For example, the knee reflex that a doctor tests during a routine physical is controlled by a single synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. While a reflex may only require the involvement of one or two synapses, synapses with interneurons in the spinal column transmit information to the brain to convey what happened. The knee jerked, or the hand was hot. In the United States, there are around 10,000 spinal cord injuries each year. Because the spinal cord is the information superhighway connecting the brain with the body, damage to the spinal cord can lead to paralysis. The extent of the paralysis depends on the location of the injury along the spinal cord and whether the spinal cord was completely severed. For example, if the spinal cord is damaged at the level of the neck, it can cause paralysis from the neck down, whereas damage to the spinal column further down may limit paralysis to the legs. Spinal cord injuries are notoriously difficult to treat because spinal nerves do not regenerate, although ongoing research suggests that stem cell transplants may be able to act as a bridge to reconnect severed nerves. Researchers are also looking at ways to prevent the inflammation that worsens nerve damage after injury. One such treatment is to pump the body with cold saline to induce hypothermia. This cooling can prevent swelling and other processes that are thought to worsen spinal cord injuries.